Okay, today is week two's one main thing. I'd like to start out by apologizing for the amateur camera work. I'm sorry about that. I meant to do this down in my lab, which is a much more professional facility than my office, as you can see here. But nonetheless, this is what we have to work with. So today, we're going to do our very first one main thing for this class. And again, as a reminder, the one main thing is essentially a concept which students have struggled with in the past, or a concept which I feel is particularly important for you to know, and not just to do well in this class or on the quizzes, but in the long term when people come and talk to you. And today's one main thing is on lactate threshold. And when we're talking about endurance exercise performance, lactate threshold is probably the most important predictor to aerobic exercise performance besides VO2 max. In fact, if you were to rank them, very clearly, number one would be VO2 max, which is the maximal amount of oxygen consumed during exercise. It's a direct indicator of energy expended for endurance performance. And then number two would very clearly be lactate threshold, which is such an important concept. As you've done your reading in the text and as you've gone over the notes, I expect that the majority of this concept has made some sense to you. The point here is that, as you saw last week when we went through bioenergetics, that lactate is a natural byproduct of metabolism during exercise, especially at high intensity exercise. The key here to remember is that we are always producing lactate. Right now, you're producing lactate as you sit there viewing this lecture, for example. But you're producing such a small amount that your body can clear it, or another way to say it would be to remove it or to use it, so that a similar or constant concentration is present in the blood. Okay. The key also to remember is that as exercise intensity increases, we will produce more and more lactate. Okay. Up to a point, our body can compensate for this, and it clears or removes this lactate at the exact same rate at which it's being produced, until we get to a specific point termed lactate threshold. Now that is the point where all of a sudden we extend ourselves beyond what we are able to do with removing the lactate. So we are producing it at a rate faster than we can remove it or get rid of it. And when that happens, as you might imagine, there's a buildup or an accumulation, very similar to anything in our lives. If we're bringing stuff in faster than we can get rid of it, well, there's going to be a buildup or an accumulation. So why is that a bad thing? Well, lactate, as I mentioned, it's a natural byproduct of metabolism, but too much lactate, an accumulation of lactate, will directly interfere with muscular contraction. It also infringes on phosphofructokinase, which, if you maybe remember from last week's lesson, was the rate-limiting enzyme of glycolysis. Very, very important enzyme. But the real thing here is it directly gets in the way of muscular contraction. Specifically, and we haven't talked about this yet, actin and myosin cross-bridging within the muscles. The more of those you have, the stronger the forces that you can produce. And so if lactate is getting in the way of some of those cross bridges, you are not going to be able to exhibit or produce a force as you normally would. Maybe the best example I can give you is when you run stairs hard, 2 at a time. We all love to run stairs 2 at a time. At the beginning, you feel great. You're running up those stairs, you're flying up. But after about, say, a minute, ask yourselves, how do you feel? Your legs feel heavy, right? Like you can't move them, like you can't pick them up. So we ask ourselves, what's happened here? Have your legs actually gotten heavier? No, right? Instead, you've accumulated a ton of lactate, and it's actually there in the muscles, and it's also in the blood, spilling over into the blood, and it's directly interfering with muscular contraction, which results in, well, essentially it's hard to continue to pick up your legs to climb those stairs 2 at a time. Maybe as an example, I've drawn this figure up on my board, and I apologize for the glare here. I want to orient you to this, and there's a very similar figure in your textbook. On the x-axis, we have exercise intensity. That means that the further we get here on the x-axis, the more intense the exercise or activity. And on the y-axis, we have blood lactate concentration. At each intensity increase, you would expect to see it to go up. But as I just mentioned, although more lactate is produced, for example, at stage 2 than at stage 1, because we're having an increased intensity, our body compensates by removing it at exactly the same rate that it's been produced. So we're producing more here than here, but our body clears it at the same rate, right, that it's being produced, thus resulting in a concentration which stays constant. Okay, it stays the same up to a point. And this point, this lactate threshold point, is the point where all of a sudden we begin to see an accumulation. In other words, we're producing lactate faster than we can remove it. And the more of an accumulation that we get, the more it's going to interfere with muscular contraction and result in our inability to produce force at the same rate. Now what that means is we're going to have to slow down, or we're going to have to stop, or we're going to have to reduce the intensity or the pace or something. So let's consider this for two different kinds of athletes. Here's the significance portion of this now. Let's consider this for an aerobic athlete, so someone who runs long distance, marathons, triathlons, cyclists, swimmers, potentially, okay? And then there's also the anaerobic athlete. Okay, now that's a different animal, okay? That's someone maybe that engages in basketball, soccer, sprinting, right? Very powerful, very fast, lots of bursts of movement. It's not long and constant intensity, it varies, okay? Two different things to consider. For an aerobic athlete, say someone who's got to run a marathon, so we're talking 2.5, 3 hours, for me it's like 4. It's a long time. They need to go at the fastest pace they can, a constant pace, without slowing down substantially, right? They're not going to be able to speed up and burst until the very end, obviously. So their key, when they are running their marathon, is to be at the highest intensity possible before lactate threshold. They are going to, during that race, be right below their lactate threshold. They'll be at an intensity that's just below it, so they don't accumulate lactate. That's something, if they've trained properly, they can maintain for a long duration of time with a similar concentration of blood lactate here as at the very, very beginning of their intensity spectrum. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Okay? So these athletes, these aerobic athletes, they got to do this for a long time. They can't afford to accumulate lactate. They are going to be just below their lactate threshold. Now, an anaerobic athlete, that's different. Okay? Think you soccer fans out there, or if anybody's played soccer or something to that nature, if there's a loose ball, you're not going to say to yourself on the field, well, I'm not going to chase after that as hard as I can because I don't want to go above my lactate threshold. No, that's not how anaerobic performance works. Rather, they are going to be at 100% intensity at times. In other words, they're going to very clearly be above their lactate threshold. That's what their expectation is, which is why they can't keep up that intensity for a long period of time. Now maybe they can stop and go hard for a little while, and then, or start and go for hard for a little while, and then stop and start and stop. That's going to happen. But along the way, when they're going at really high intensities, they're going to accumulate lactate. So for that athlete, the soccer player, the basketball player, the football player, the sprinter, they're not concerned with staying below lactate threshold. Why? Well, they don't have to do that intensity, that activity for a longer duration of time. They can start and stop, or just do it once and they're done, like a sprinter, okay? So they are more concerned with not the accumulation of lactate, because that's going to happen no matter what, but rather, how quickly after they've accumulated the lactate can they remove it and come back down to resting or close to resting levels. The ramifications for that could be halftime. For example, during halftime, can an athlete that's been in soccer or basketball, can they reduce this concentration? Can they remove some of that to get back down to normal levels, or maybe a timeout or an injury delay or something to that nature? So lactate threshold is an important concept for both aerobic and anaerobic athletes, but it's different it's important for different reasons, as we just explained. The aerobic athlete wants to stay just below that lactate threshold, okay, for optimal performance. The anaerobic athlete is going to go way above that threshold. So they're concerned with how quickly can we get that concentration back down to normal. That's today's one main thing. Very, very important concept. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know.